Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I trust you've been having your own conference biscuits to recreate the whole conference experience. I hope you all got supplies in at the beginning, that you're getting through those now. Now, for our next keynote, we are very lucky to have Professor Alison Gopnik from the University of California at Berkeley. She, of course, is very eminent and will be known to many of you, if not all of you, and was one of the founders of the whole field of theory of mind. In addition to more than 100 papers she's had published, she is the author of award-winning books such as The Philosophical Baby and The Gardener and the Carpenter. Now, thanks to the wonders of technology and to allow for the time difference, we are able to watch Alison's talk that she has done specially for us while she is busy getting up early in the morning, ready to answer your questions afterwards. So this talk is an hour long. It's a great talk. Do be putting your questions into Slido, and then Alison will be joining me afterwards. We very much look forward to talking to her and being able to put your questions to her. So here's Alison's talk on life history and learning.
Well, I'm delighted to be here speaking to the British Psychological Society as someone who got her PhD in Oxford and goes back as often as I can. And what I'm going to do today is talk about a really interesting concept in evolutionary biology called life history, and how that evolutionary biology concept could help to inform the way that we understand the mind. Now, if you imagine an Alpha Centauran biologist who came down to visit the Earth during the Pleistocene and was trying to figure out what is it that makes this new branch of primates scurrying around different from the primates that are already there. One of the things that she would have noticed right away, perhaps the most distinctive thing, is their life history. If she just looked at their theory of mind and their tool use and other kinds of cognitive properties, she would have said, well, I don't know, these don't look so different. But if she'd looked at their life history, she would have been really surprised, because human beings have a really radically different life history than our closest relatives. And we've recently, I've recently co-edited a special issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, where we've tried to look at the relationship between life history and learning with a number of really distinguished biologists and developmental psychologists. So why would that Alpha Centauran biologist have been so surprised? Well, if you look at chimps, by the time this chimp in the Gombe is 7 years old, he's already producing as much food as he's consuming. So this 7-year-old chimp is already pretty much mature. And if you compare that to humans, even in forager cultures, humans aren't producing as much food as they're consuming until they're about 15 years old. And, you know, my son is 30, and in modern cultures, sometimes we're still writing checks for them even when they're 30. So there's a much longer period of dependence. And this goes along with another interesting phenomenon, which is that we also have a much longer period of old age. So we have this extended childhood, and then we also have this phenomenon of old age. So again, if you look in forager cultures, life expectancy is lower, but that's because there's very high infant mortality. If you manage to live to your 30s, you're quite likely to live till you're 70. Whereas if you look at chimpanzees, most of the time chimpanzees have died by the time they're 50. In particular, chimpanzees, and indeed almost all other mammals, don't have menopause. Their fertility and their lifespan are very closely correlated. And human beings, again, even in forager societies, are living for this extra 20 years after their fertility. So those are both really striking features of our life history that make us very different from our closest primate relatives. Now, this Alpha Centauran biologist would have paid special attention to those life history variables, because assuming that Alpha Centaurans have developed advanced biology, she would have known that life history often is really important for natural selection. So often what seems to happen is that rather than selecting for particular features of an adult animal, instead, natural selection seems to select for different life history features. And in particular, there's a striking correlation across a very wide range of species between life history, particularly this protracted childhood and very high parental investment, and brain size, learning, things that we think of as being very characteristically human. So sort of the poster animals for this correlation are actually not even mammals, but birds. So if you compare, for instance, the domestic chicken, chickens are basically, with apologies to chicken lovers in the audience, they're basically dumb as stuff. So they're not very smart. They're very good, or another way of putting it is they're extremely well designed to do one or two things, like peck for grain very well. They're not very good at learning to do anything new. And they're mature, and in fact, we can show that those grain pecking abilities, which are not trivial, are in place almost as soon as the chickens are born, and they're mature in about 2 weeks. You compare that with, say, the New Caledonian crow. The New Caledonian crows don't reach maturity until about 2 years. They're fledglings for a very long time. And of course, the New Caledonian crows have tool use abilities and general intelligence that rivals primates like chimpanzees. And if you look among primates, you also see this relationship. So Steve Piantadosi and Celeste Kidd also has a paper in the Philosophical Transactions, showed this very close relationship between what you might think of as a measure of intelligence and the weaning time in primates. I should mention that special issue also has a wonderful paper by Natalie Uomini and Russell Gray detailing the long immaturity of crows and jays and generally intelligent corvids. In fact, you don't have to just look at primates who are close to us. You can also see this relationship in other mammals, marsupials, for example. So, for example, if you compare these two marsupials, on one side is the quokka, the world's cutest animal, both in terms of name and look. On the other side is a Virginia opossum. These animals are about the same size, but the quokka has a baby that stays in the pouch for about a year and only has one baby at a time. In comparison, the possum has multiple babies. The babies mature much more quickly. They only stay in the pouch for a few months. And there's much less investment. Only the biological mother is involved in taking care of the babies. And if you look at the quokkas, there's pair-bonded mates, and both the males and females are involved in caring for the babies. Now, humans might feel a little more like the possum than like the quokka. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But in fact, of course, we're much more like the quokkas, where we only have one baby at a time. And as we'll see in a minute, we have a very wide range of people who are invested in taking care of those babies. You can even see this in insects. This is one of my favorite recent papers. It's by Emily Snell-Root, also in that special issue. And what she did was actually look at butterflies, cabbage white butterflies. And what she found was that there was variance in the butterflies between those who had very, very simple kinds of cognitive capacities and those who had still pretty simple but slightly more complicated ones. So it turns out that if you know the book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, that tells you everything you need to know about the life history of butterflies. What they basically do is lay eggs on a leaf, and then the egg sprouts into a caterpillar, and the caterpillar eats up the leaf and builds a cocoon and turns into a beautiful, beautiful butterfly. But there's some variation in how it is that butterflies do this. So some butterflies just go to anything that's green, like this kale. But other butterflies are more choosy. They're not forced into eating kale. They can actually, for instance, land on a red leaf and discover that it actually has good nutritional qualities. And they can avoid leaves that already have eggs that were laid by competitors. And just this small difference in flexibility and learning turns out to be correlated with a difference in life history. So the dumber butterflies produce many more eggs, and those eggs mature much more quickly than the butterflies who rely on learning. So this seems to be a very, very general principle that you find across many, many different animals across biology. And again, we humans are way off on the end of the spectrum on all of these dimensions. Now, that might sound like a just so story, but we can even find fossil evidence for this development in the course of hominin evolution. So this is from a paper looking at comparing Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens fossils. And looking at fossil teeth to try to estimate life history and finding that even compared to Neanderthals, Homo sapiens had this longer period of childhood, this longer life history. The paper that just came out that suggests that even Australopithecus were already starting to develop a longer life history compared to the previous hominins, even though their life history was not as long as that of humans. So life history definitely seems to be something that was literally changing in the course of our evolution as humans. You might ask, why did this happen? Why would we see these changes? And I want to emphasize that this life history is very costly. So we have these very helpless children who we have to depend on for a long, long time. And those helpless children are accompanied by helpless older people. So we have this very extended period that seems as if it's sort of counterintuitive from an evolutionary point of view. We have to put a lot of energy into taking care of both the babies and old people. And of course, the current crisis has made this particularly vivid. Why? What happened that led to this apparently counterintuitive change? Well, there's a lot of ideas, but certainly one thing that seems to have contributed was ecological variability. So this is a chart that looks at the average temperatures. And what you can see is that during the time that we evolved, it wasn't so much that things got colder or hotter or drier, but they got to be much less predictable, much more variable. And the argument is that this kind of variable environment seems to select for a long period of childhood and a reliance on learning. So now humans are causing climate change, but in the past it looks as if climate change is one of the things that caused humans. You can see this strategy and difference if you look at neuroscience as well. So here's a slide about the development of connections, synapses in the human brain across development. And what you can see is that there's this early period when many, many, many new connections are being formed that corresponds to that extended childhood that we have. And then there's a kind of tipping point, and the connections that are used a lot are maintained and strengthened, and the connections that aren't used are pruned, as they say, disappear. And in particular, as we know, the prefrontal cortex, that's the green line on the slide, which is the executive office of the brain, responsible for all sorts of adult capacities like long-term planning and goal-directed action. That's actually the latest part of the brain to mature. So when you actually look at brain development, what you see is a really interesting contrast between, it's almost like two different brains. There's a brain in that early helpless period is not very good at doing anything, not very good at going out and foraging or finding food or doing any of the things that you might expect that an organism would have to do, but is very well designed for learning, very well designed to be flexible, to be able to respond to a changing environment. And then you have a later brain that takes advantage of the experience in that early period to be able to be much more effective, to be able to actually go out and act and be goal-directed, be focused, be able to do all the things that we do as adults. Now, often when people are describing this pattern, particularly the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, they describe it as if the kids were sort of defective grown-ups. So they're defined as, look at these, stupid, wandering, inattentive young children. But if you think about it from the perspective of learning, having a period that's like that, even if it makes you helpless, might be really, really a good idea in terms of being able to learn about the environment around you. And again, let me emphasize how expensive this period of early helpless learning is. This is one of my favorite slides. This shows how many calories you use at different stages of development. So even in adulthood, our brains are, like Macs, they're very expensive computing gadgets. So about 20% of our calories are going to our brains, just as you sit here and listen to this right now. But if you look at what we're like when we're 4 or 5, when we're 4, 66% of our calories are actually going to our brains. So, a sort of picture of my 4-year-old grandson is he's like a villain out of Doctor Who. He's basically this giant hungry brain perched on, tiny little legs who goes around the world hypnotizing us all and getting us to just feed not only his little body, but especially feed that hungry brain of his, which is actually not a bad description of my grandson. So again, this period is costly, both in terms of the amount of work that it takes to just take care of the children, but literally costly in terms of the amount of calories you need to sustain this early hungry brain. So that double investment, the investment in just calorie production, but also that investment in keeping that brain going, seems to have led to a bunch of other distinctively human adaptations. So if you went back to that chimpanzee babies are basically taken care of by their biological mothers. So biological mothers are doing almost all of the caregiving, and that's true for the other, our other closely related great apes as well. But during the course of human evolution, and again, there's even some fossil evidence for this, humans developed what I think of as the investment triple threat. So first of all, we have pair bonding. So we have fathers and mothers who have close ties to one another and who cooperate to actually raise babies together. We just sort of take that for granted, but it's actually very rare. Only about 5% of mammals show this pattern of pair bonding. That, by the way, is my son and my grandson. We have alloparents, namely we have people who are not actually biological parents who are nevertheless involved in caring for children. And the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy has made this point. This is a wonderful book showing that in forager cultures, many people are taking care of babies and children. There's a recent lovely study by Barry Hewlett that showed that babies in forager cultures are even being breastfed by multiple women during the course of a week. Again, very different from our closest primate relatives. And we have my personal favorite, grandmothers. So if you look carefully behind these three beautiful children, you can see there's a grandmother lurking in the background. And as I mentioned before, grandmothers, postmenopausal grandmothers, are strikingly human phenomenon. So we're among very few, in fact, only 2 mammals that continue to live past their fertility. And what you can see is that, again, in this special issue of the Royal Society transactions, Kristen Hawkes is the great anthropologist who's argued for what she calls the grandmother hypothesis, that it was actually the contributions of these grandmothers, these postmenopausal women between 50 and 70, that enabled that long period of childhood. So it's actually the grandmothers who are responsible for the survival, especially of the toddlers, of the 2-year-olds. That depends on the food that the grandmothers are providing. So that suggests that grandmothers are playing a really important role in just the physical survival of these helpless babies. But this picture points out to something else that grandmothers are doing. So one of the things about human beings is that we're cultural species. We rely not just on having a lot of intelligence, but also on being able to pass on information and knowledge from one generation to another. It's one of our most distinctive characteristics. And there's lovely work by Michael Gervin, again in this special issue, which suggests that in forager cultures, it's the grandmothers and grandfathers, it's the people between 50 and 70 who are most clearly serving this function of passing on information to the next generation. So the sort of people in the prime of life are basically spending their time doing all the things that you need to do in your prime of life. They're foraging and fighting and mating and getting resources and finding their way in the pecking order, doing all those midlife kinds of things. And it's actually the grandparents who are not as effective at doing those things anymore, who are taking on the role of passing on information, particularly big information about how the world works, the kinds of things that you'd see in stories or in songs or in myths. It's the older people who are passing that information on to the children. I think sometimes when you look at developmental psychology or psychology in general, there's a sort of tendency to act as if, surprise, surprise, those, midlife, I don't know, a guy in his 40s is kind of in his 30s is the epitome of cognitive achievement, and everything else is either just building up to that or falling off from that. Maybe not surprisingly, because those guys are usually the ones who are writing those papers. But if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, would be kind of weird to have this long period where you're not functioning as well, and then these two long periods, childhood and old age, where you're not functioning as well from the perspective of, say, executive function. Why would you do that? Why would you have that from an evolutionary point of view? And I think the picture that comes up is there's really this kind of division of labor where the people in midlife are doing some of the things that we think of like being productive, but then it's the children and the old people who are doing some of the things that are most distinctively human, like being able to learn and both accumulating and passing on cultural information. So what I say sometimes is it's really like we're really human up till puberty and after menopause, and in between we're sort of glorified primates doing all the things that primates do best. Now, from this perspective, there's a kind of interesting observation to make, which is that adult intelligence and child intelligence, and indeed older adult intelligence, might be really different. The kinds of intelligence that you need to do things out in the world is really different from the kind of intelligence you need to learn or the kind of intelligence you need to be involved in cultural transmission. And what that suggests is that, and in fact, if you look at psychology, it's interesting that you see very different kinds of topics, very different kinds of domains in, say, adult cognitive psychology on the one hand, and child cognitive development on the other. So if you read a standard cognitive psychology textbook, it will talk about inference and attention and planning and decision making. Those are all the things that are really important cognitive capacities in adults. If you go and take the cognitive development class, you'll hear about statistical learning or grammar induction or conceptual change, things that are really relevant to this task of learning the big parameters of how the world around you works. And that in itself suggests that there might be something quite different in these two kinds of intelligence. And an idea that I've been working on, it's the center of my paper in the special issue. And it's an idea that comes from neuroscience and computer science in particular, is the idea that there are actually trade-offs between these different kinds of intelligences. So if you're comparing, for example, the kind of intelligence that you need to learn versus the kind of intelligence you need to act effectively, people in computer science talk about a trade-off between exploitation versus exploration. So exploration is really what you need to do to be able to learn effectively, go out, find out things out, get lots of information about the world, consider many different kinds of possibilities. And that trades off with this exploitation ability, this ability to actually go out and make things happen. So the idea that I've argued for is that you could think about this life history as a way of resolving this exploitation versus exploration trade-off. And in computer science in particular, there's a contrast between different ways of searching a problem space. So imagine you're trying to solve a problem. You could think about it as here's a big box full of potential solutions to this problem, and you're right here. That's where you are now, what you're thinking about, what you think the likeliest solution is now. When you learn, you could think about that learning as searching through this space of possible solutions and trying to find the right one. And it turns out that there isn't any optimal single way of doing that search. And if you think about it, you can see why. One thing you could do is you could do what's called a low temperature search. So what you could do is just try to make very small adjustments to what you think already, and then try and see if those small adjustments will lead to a better solution. That means that you might get something that's a pretty good solution pretty quickly, but you might miss something that's actually a better solution, but has a lower probability. Alternatively, what you could do is you could do a high temperature search. You could bounce around that space, trying out all sorts of things just for a few minutes, seeing how they work, then bouncing around to some other solution in a kind of noisy way with a lot of you think of it as a kind of high entropy search. And that has the advantage that you might find a solution that's very different from where you are now. It can get you out of a local optimum. But of course, you're going to spend a lot of time considering options that are not actually going to turn out to be helpful options. And in computer science, the solution to this is something called simulated annealing. And the idea behind simulated annealing is that you start out with this very high temperature search, and then you slowly cool off. And what that means is that by looking, for instance, through this space of possible solutions, even if you start out over here, if you start out over here, for example, you might not actually find a close part of the space that actually is more productive. But if you do this high temperature search, then you can find this other solution, which actually is has a higher score, is more productive. And then because you cool off, you aren't going to spend all your time trying different things. Now you're actually going to settle on that appropriate solution. So my hypothesis is that childhood is evolution's way of resolving explore-exploit trade-offs and performing this kind of simulated annealing. All right, now is there any evidence for this? Well, from this perspective, many things that you might think of as being features from the perspective of exploration are actually bugs from the perspective of exploitation. So, and if you think about what children are characteristically like, many of the things that they do that have in the past been seen as cognitive deficits, have been seen as bugs, are actually features from the perspective of trying to do this kind of wide hypothesis search. So for example, being noisy, being variable, producing this kind of high entropy random behavior, being willing to take risks, being impulsive, being involved in the kind of general play that children are involved in. Being curious is something that we think of as characteristically like children. Being sort of unnaturally optimistic, and we've done some work showing that this is true about children, assuming that the world is going to be okay. Those are all things that are not such great ideas if what you want to do is go out and deal with a hostile world effectively, but they are good if what you want is to learn as much as possible. And when I describe that bouncy high temperature search, I think everybody who has a 4-year-old, everyone who's sitting at home with COVID with a 4-year-old in the background will think, yeah, that sounds a lot more like my 4-year-old than the careful low temperature search does. And in fact, if you go out and look at the literature, I mean, of course, for most tasks, having this kind of executive function ability makes you better. So for most things, being focused and organized and goal-directed is actually more effective. So if you take almost any cognitive task, you're going to see that grown-ups are going to do better than children. But there's this interesting category of examples where, in fact, the younger learners are more exploratory than the older learners, and that actually allows them to learn better. So if the task involves learning something that's unusual, then younger learners can actually be better. Children can actually be better than adults. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples from our research that suggests this. So for a long time, we've been looking at how children can infer things about the abstract structure of a causal system. So how can you figure out what causes what? And in particular, can you figure out the big, broad parameters of a causal system, how it sort of works in general? And we do this with our very simple device, the Blicket detector. Here's the Blicket detector. You can do this at home, I guess, if you're online. And what we do is show children and adults this pattern. So you see block D goes on the detector, it goes on 3 times, nothing happens. E goes on once, nothing happens. D and F go on together and the detector lights up. The question is D a Blicket? Blicketness is the thing that makes the machine go. And the question is D a Blicket? Is E a Blicket? Is F a Blicket? And what we find is that most adults, I assume you at home, will say, well, okay, D is not a Blicket, E is not a Blicket, F is, because D and F are making the machine go together, but D by itself is not. And you make that inference because you're assuming that the way this machine works is that only individual objects make it go. So it's each individual object has the causal property of making it go or not. But suppose you saw this series of events, A, B, and C go on and nothing happens. but A and C together do make the machine go, you might conclude, oh, okay, this machine works differently. This machine works on this unusual combination conjunctive principle. This machine requires that you have two objects to make it go, which is possible, but less likely than the original hypothesis. And now if you went back to this sequence, you might think, oh, okay, I had it wrong. If this machine works in that unlikely combination way, then actually D and F are both duplicates. So what we did was we just did this experiment. We gave children and adults, and as you'll see, people of different ages, this individual or combination kind of training, and then we gave them that ambiguous test. And the question is, do you think that D is a duplicate or not? And then when you go to try and make the machine go, do you use single blocks or combinations of blocks? That's the dependent variable. And here's, we used a slightly more complicated procedure, in fact, because of Goddamn Reviewer 2. But here's a child actually doing it.
For us to figure out which of these are duplicates. So let's call this one triangle, okay? What should we call this one? Square. Square. And what should we call this one? Ball. Ball. Sounds good. Okay, so let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine. Are you ready? Let's see. Look at that. The machine did not turn on. Let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine again, okay? Look, the machine did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine one more time, okay? Let's see. Look, the machine did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put square on the machine, okay? Look at that. The machine did not turn on. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle and ball on the machine together. Look at that! The machine turned on! Now let's see what happens when we put triangle, square, and ball all on the machine together. Are you ready? Let's see. Look at that! The machine turned on! Okay. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle and ball on the machine together. You ready? Let's see. Look, the machine turned on. So Scarlett, do you think that triangle is a duplicate or not a duplicate? A duplicate. And do you think that square is a duplicate or not a duplicate? No. No. And do you think that ball is a duplicate or not a duplicate? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Scarlett, which of these should we use to make my machine turn on? Those two? Yeah.
Okay, so this is an adorable 4-year-old, and what's striking, I think, about this is, I think even for grown-ups, it's kind of hard to track exactly what was going on with all those different duplicates, but this 4-year-old is completely attentive and paying attention and getting it right, inferring this combination. And what we discovered, we went out and actually did this with both 4-year-olds and undergraduates at Berkeley, was that in this combination condition, the 4-year-olds were doing much better than the adults. In the other condition, when we actually gave them evidence that suggested that it was the individual blocks, both the 4-year-olds and the adults said that D was not a duplicate and F was. So it wasn't just that the 4-year-olds always said that D was a duplicate. In that condition, the 4-year-olds and the adults looked the same. But in the combination condition, the 4-year-olds were much more likely both to say that D was a duplicate and to put multiple blocks on the machine than the adults, the undergraduates were. Now we could ask, was this just true about, privileged kids in preschools in Berkeley? So what we did was actually look at children in different cultural circumstances. We started out looking at children in Head Start programs in Berkeley and Oakland. These are programs for low-income children. And if you look at some of those kind of executive function measures, things like, what you'd think of as vocabulary or IQ or executive function, then very characteristic
Hi everyone. We're trying to work out what's happening with the Wi-Fi. Looks as if there has been a Wi-Fi issue that's stopping the video playing there, which is a shame. So we'll see what's going to, it looks like it might be back. I'll shut up in case it is.
Prior, a more peaked prior, assuming that objects, causal systems do have this kind of combination, this individual disjunctive structure. So is it just that you have a gradual change as you get more experience of the world? Or to go back to the life history point, we know that there are these kind of life history transitions, real discontinuities. So there's a big difference between preschool and school age and adolescence, and then adolescence and adulthood in human biological development. There's even biological and neurological transitions at these points. So what we did was we took the same tasks, and now we did them with 6-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 12-year-olds, adolescents. And what we found was that the 6-year-olds looked more like the adults. They were less flexible than the 4-year-olds. Interestingly, the 9 to 11-year-olds were pretty much that they weren't statistically significant from the 6 to 7-year-olds. So that extra 5 years of experience didn't seem to be making a difference. But when we looked at the adolescents, the 12 to 14-year-olds, again, they're not statistically significant now from the adults, although they are different from the younger children. This is in a PNAS paper. So it looked like there were these changes in these periods of transition when kids were changing from preschool to school age and from school age to adolescence. This is just showing the same thing. We didn't see the same pattern for the disjunctive condition, for the other condition. We also did the same, very similar kind of task. I won't have enough time to go into the details about it, but this one was about social inferences rather than physical inferences. So this is not about why the block makes the machine go, but why a person did what they did. Why did someone go on a slightly scary bicycle or a diving board, or decide not to go on that toy? And there's a very old finding, classic finding in social psychology, which shows that adults have a bias in favor of explaining things in terms of underlying traits that people have. So if someone does something like not go on the diving board, it's because they are scared, they're cowardly, they're less of a risk taker. And adults will do this even when actually the data supports the opposite conclusion, the conclusion that it's the situation, something about the diving board that was responsible. So what we did was give people of different ages covariation data that either supported this trait hypothesis or the situation or neither. And we found something interestingly different in this case. So in this case, what we found was, again, the 4-year-olds were more flexible than the adults. Here's the adults who are showing the kind of classic trait bias. So when they have evidence for the situation hypothesis, they're less likely to make situation conclusions. They have a bias towards traits. The 4-year-olds are doing much better. The 6-year-olds aren't doing as well as the 4-year-olds. But here in this social context, it's actually the adolescents who are the most flexible. And that suggests that adolescents, that's consistent with other kinds of evidence, neuroscience evidence, and other kinds of evidence suggesting that adolescents are actually more flexible. Their adolescence is this kind of extra period of plasticity, particularly oriented towards social learning, towards understanding about the social world. In an experiment that we've just completed, what we did was take this idea of exploration versus exploitation and try to test it again by using the kind of paradigm that originally had led to this exploration versus exploitation idea. And this is what, again, computer scientists call a reinforcement learning paradigm. So what happens in this example is that you see, a bunch of Blickets and Blicket detectors, but now there's actually something riding on what happens with the Blickets and Blicket detectors. So here's the way the experiment works. You see this Blicket detector and you see this block with white stripes. And now, instead of having the experimenter put the blocks on, you get to choose which blocks whether or not you'll put a block on the machine and find out what happens. So you put this white block on, and there's you learn beforehand that zaffs will make the machine go, and if you get a zaff, then you will get another sticker. So it's good to have a zaff. It makes the machine happy. You get a sticker. By the way, I have given this talk a couple of times now in Silicon Valley because I've been doing a lot of collaborations with people in AI, and I changed this to 1 billion stickers, or gaining 1 billion stickers or losing 1 billion stickers for that audience. In the adult case, it's a certain amount of money that the M-Turker is gonna earn. Now you see this black striped one, and what happens is you put it on. Oh, it's not a zaff, and you actually lose stickers or money. Now you see this white dotty one, you put it on, and that's a zaff, you get stickers. And now the question is, now you see this black spotted one, what should you do? Should you put it on the detector or not? Well, what adults do, as we'll see, is they look at this pattern and they say, oh, I get it. White ones make it go, are zaffs. Black ones are not zaffs. If this is a zaff and if this is not a zaff and I put it on, I'm going to lose money. So I should just avoid it. I should just not take the risk. But of course, in fact, it could be that the actual outcome is different. It could be that this black spotted one is, in fact, a zaff. And the rule could be this more complicated and unusual two-dimensional rule, a rule that says that something has to be both striped and black in order to, anything that isn't striped and black is a zaff. So the only not zaffs are the black striped ones. Now, if that's the actual setup, then what will happen is that you're going to make a mistake. You're going to lose potential reward because you too quickly jump to the conclusion that the one-dimensional rule was correct. And Rich and Garakis have shown that that's what happens with adults. So what they've shown is that adults very characteristically get stuck in these learning traps, as they call them, where you don't learn something because you're avoiding a risk. And, this may sound like this is a weird thing that you're doing in the lab, but that kind of behavior is actually something that we see in real life a lot, and it seems to be responsible for things like anxieties and phobias. So for instance, if you have a phobia, what happens is because you're terrified, you never actually say, well, get near a spider, so you never find out that actually the spiders are not going to cause you harm. You get on an airplane once and you have a terrible experience, and then you never get on the airplane again, so you never learn that the airplane actually is mostly okay. And the therapy for anxieties and phobias is actually to expose you to the thing that's dangerous. So this isn't just something that is happening in the lab, it's something that happens in real life as well. So what we did was set up a child-friendly task where you got 4 sets of these blocks. And then we had both children of different ages and adults. And just like Garakis, we found that adults were avoiding about half of the blocks that they could have been positive, that they could have gained something from. 7-year-olds were more likely to approach the blocks. But 4-year-olds, and again, this will fit anyone who's at home with a 4-year-old now, were very likely to approach the blocks, even though they were losing stickers. And even though they were upset about losing stickers, they just couldn't resist seeing what was going to happen if they put the blocks on. But the interesting consequence was that then at the end, we asked the participants about what the rule was. And the 4-year-olds, as a result of their impulsive exploration, were much more likely to actually learn the correct rule than either the 7-year-olds or especially the adults. So the adults were stuck in this learning trap. They weren't, the two-dimensional rule is actually the correct one. They weren't learning that correct rule because they hadn't been willing to take the risk to get the information. So the children seemed to prefer the information to the reward, and as a result, they were learning more. Whereas the adults were preferring the reward to the information, which made them actually better at exploiting, but less good at learning. And we replicated that, pre-registered it. Let me get back to the other part of the life history. So I was talking before about the way that what I've been talking about so far is this idea of an exploration-exploitation trade-off where we have an early period where we can explore, and that's really what childhood is all about, is about having this period of exploration. But the other side of that is the old age, is the extra parental investment, particularly those investing grandmothers. And I think it's worth pointing out, I said before, we're one of only 2 mammals who have postmenopausal grandmothers. It turns out the other mammal who does this is actually the orca, the killer whale. And orcas are, for a long time, I would give this talk and I'd say orcas, like, why orcas? Who knows? But I can't say we're the only ones with menopause, because orcas have menopause too. But recently there's been a bunch of really lovely experiments showing that in orca communities, orcas are also among few mammals who have strong cultural traditions. And it's actually the grandmothers who are out there leading the pod, using the information that they gleaned about what the best feeding grounds are to keep the group going, even when in circumstances when the environment changes and it's hard to find food. So grandmothers, both for orcas and for humans, seem to be passing on cultural information. But of course, the grandmothers are also just nurturing and taking care of those babies in that helpless period, as well as the mothers and fathers and alloparents. And I think an important idea that's out there as well, Willem Frankenhuis and Emily Snell-Root talk about this in our special issue, is that it's actually those signals of protection that are what allow the wide-ranging exploration. So again, you have the children who are doing the exploration, doing the learning. You have the older people, the caregivers, who are putting the energy into taking care of the children. And it takes both of those to be able to have our uniquely human niche. And so I'm going to end with an experiment that I love, not from my lab, but from Nim Tottenham's lab. This was recently in Nature Human Behavior. And this slide is a little complicated, but let me just explain it to you. This takes off from work that's actually done with rats. Of course, one of the oldest results in all of psychology is that you put a rat in a maze and it goes down one arm of the maze and it gets shocked. You put the rat in the maze, it goes down the other arm of the maze and nothing happens, it's fine. And then, of course, the rat is going to avoid the arm of the maze that leads to the shock. That's Psychology 101. But if you think back to what I was saying before about approach and avoid and learning traps, that very basic kind of avoidance learning has a real disadvantage. And the real disadvantage is that if you never go down the arm where you were once shocked, you're never going to learn that the situation might have changed. You're never going to learn that, oh no, now there isn't a shock there, there's more food down that arm of the maze. And what Regina Sullivan and her colleagues discovered was that if you looked at young rats, particularly the equivalent of adolescent rats, they actually preferred to go down the arm that led to the shock. But they only did that when a parent was present. So if the mother was present, if they were getting signals of caregiving, then they were willing, and not only willing, but preferred to explore this strange, unrewarding outcome. If the parent wasn't there, if the mother wasn't there, then they showed the kind of classic pattern of avoiding the arm. So what Nim Tottenham and her colleagues did was essentially replicate this with 4-year-old human children. So what happened was that the children saw, they didn't get a shock, but they heard a really unpleasant noise. And it was associated with one of these shapes, with a square or with a triangle. In one condition, the children experienced this kind of avoidance conditioning just by themselves. In the other condition, they did it with a parent present, with a caregiver present. And then the caregiver left, and the children had a choice. Literally, they constructed a maze for 3-year-olds. The children had a choice of going down the arm of the maze that was marked with the aversive stimulus, or going down the arm of the maze that was marked with the stimulus that wasn't aversive. And what they discovered was that if the parent had been present, then the children, like the young rats, were more actually preferred to explore the aversive option. They wanted to get more information. But when the parent wasn't present, when they were just on their own during the conditioning period, they didn't prefer it. In fact, they preferred the safe option. So that suggests this is very much like the result that we got in the experiment that Emily Liquin did that I just told you about, in the sense that the children are preferring information to reward. They're willing to take the risk of exploring a risky option. But that depends on having this caregiver there. That depends on the idea that someone is there to take care of you. And, I don't know if the rats are quite thinking this, but at least implicitly, the idea is that these signals of being in a safe caregiving environment, the idea that you're going to get care, is the thing that enables you to go out and explore, the thing that enables you to go out and approach the world, take risks, find out more about the world. So this caregiving is something that seems to be very central, the caregiving that gets done, especially by those older people, especially by those grandmothers. That seems to be something that that in and of itself is helping to allow the kind of exploration and learning that the children are doing. And here's the actual results from that Tottenham experiment. So what seems to be happening is that caregiving in itself is leading to the ability to be more exploratory. And again, in the special life history special issue, there are several papers looking at this in the context of things like early negative experiences where there aren't signals of caregiving, cases like abuse or neglect. And there's some evidence that one of the consequences of that is what people sometimes call a live fast, die young life history strategy, where there isn't this extended period of exploration. There isn't a sense that it's possible to take risks or to find out about what the world is like. Instead, the animals or humans are very quickly trying to get into an exploit mode. And in the short run, that is an advantage, but of course in the long run, it means that they don't have the range of possibilities that are enabled by having that longer period available of development. Now, let me say a little bit, so that's the big picture. So the big picture that comes out of thinking about humans in this life history context is that those times on the end, the babies and the older people are actually doing things that are absolutely essential to our human survival and thriving, even though they're sort of doing it quietly in the background of what the prime of life people are doing. And again, this makes sense as a kind of trade-off, a division of labor. So when you're in that midlife period, your resources really go to things like effective action. And again, Michael Goodman in his work on old age suggests that it's a distraction. Again, this will be something that is very relevant to people staying home with COVID. It's hard to actually do the work that you have to do and take care of those children at the same time. And if you could bring Granny into the mix or Grandpa into the mix, have them be in your social bubble, you're much better off in terms of being able to actually go out and do the kind of work that you have to do. And what this generally suggests is that care and caregiving is just essential to our human capacity. But it's essential in a way that's really different from the way that people typically think. So I'll end, this is a video, actually it's a film that I love. This is the Berkeley Child Study Center. And the Berkeley Child Study Center is our early childhood education and development program at Berkeley. And we recently discovered these films from the 1920s of children in a child study center back in the 20s. And I find this incredibly touching. These children are all gone, I suspect, by now. But what you can see is that what the children are doing is a very good exemplar of this kind of explore, exploit, care triad. So what's happening is the children are in this safe, protected environment, literally in a garden, And the grown-ups who are around them are giving them food, giving them juice here, giving them juice and water, giving them resources in the background, providing a kind of safe haven, an environment in which the children can explore. But the children are the ones who are going out and finding out about the physical world, about the biological world, etc. And as you watch this film, one thing that will strike you is the kids are very happily doing things that we probably would have a hard time getting past licensing in preschools. In preschools nowadays, they're doing things like using hammers and nails and saws, apparently perfectly happily, the way that kids do in forager societies. And that's a very different picture of the relationship between caregivers and children, between carers and children, and the kind of typical relationship that's become dominant in our culture and in our society. My most recent book is called The Gardener and the Carpenter. And the reason why I chose that title was that the picture we have about what parents or caregivers are supposed to do is this parenting picture, which suggests that what caregivers are doing is shaping children to come out a particular way, shaping them to be smarter or to be more knowledgeable or something like that. And that's very, very different from the picture that comes out of this life history perspective, that comes out of the psychology. Remember, that picture is a picture where the caregivers are providing a safe environment in which the kids can actually go out and do the kind of exploration and learning that they're designed by evolution to do. And I suggest that this is much more like a kind of garden than being a gardener than being a carpenter. If you're a gardener, you don't ever know exactly how your plants are going to turn out. What you can do is to provide a safe environment in which they can flourish. But there's an even deeper point here, which is that what you do in a garden, in order for it to thrive, particularly to thrive in conditions of variability, in conditions where things are changing a lot, what you need is to have lots of variability. You need to have lots of different creatures, lots of different plants doing different things with different strengths and different weaknesses. And it's that collective variability, that noisiness, that randomness, that lack of control that actually enables a system to flourish as environments vary. And for us exploratory humans, that's even more true. So it's that ability to say, no, it isn't that we have a particular outcome and we're shaping the children to come out to have that particular outcome. Instead, what we're doing is providing this safe environment, like the environment that is cued for the rats by the mother's present. We're providing that environment, and then we're actually letting the children, we're letting the people in that early phase of life do the kind of exploration that they need to do. And in particular for the older people, one of the things that we're doing is passing along our traditions, our culture, our knowledge to the younger generation, knowing that they aren't going to just take that on, that they're going to change it, they're going to have a new mix, they're going to do things that are a bit different from the way that we did things. And I think this evolutionarily designed life history program, as it were, young children who are exploring, people who in the prime of life who are producing, older people who are teaching and nurturing, is under a lot of pressure in our current culture. In spite of the fact that we have, enormous resources, we don't have good resources either for children or for older people. And again, the COVID crisis has made that especially vivid. So the children are not being taken care of, the children are at home, and the older people, we're discovering, are not being very well taken care of. And the older people and the children are isolated from one another. Of course, we're especially isolated now, but even in our normal culture, we're isolated. The children are off in preschools, and the older people are off in assisted living facilities, for example. And I think the picture that comes through thinking about life history is a picture in which both of those kinds of caring are essential. And one of the things that happens is that all that caring, the caring we do for children when we're sitting at home and with COVID with toddlers, or for that matter, the caring we do when we take care of our elders, is invisible in the GDP. It doesn't even show up as a possibility. The people who do that work which we're beginning to realize is absolutely essential work, are paid less and have lower status than just about anybody else in the society. So I hope that maybe one of the shocks of the current crisis will be that we'll recognize that the really essential workers are those carers. They're the ones who allow the children to flourish and to explore. And they're the ones that allow older people to play their role of cultural transmission and nurture. So that we can end up having both social systems like early childhood education systems and systems that involve elders that can really let us take this amazing evolutionary life history pattern that has already let us learn and understand so much and really put it to use even in modern culture and society. So let me end by thanking, as always, my collaborators and the people who support me, especially, of course, the graduate students, Emily Liquin, who did the Explore Exploit work, Chris Lucas, who did the work about different kinds of causal inference, some of my computational collaborators on Explore Exploit, and then, of course, the people who are supporting this work, including the National Science Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, and the DARPA Machine Common Sense Project. And I'll be around to answer some questions. And thank you very much for coming out or maybe going into your living rooms and hearing this talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Alison Gopnik. What a great talk that was. And I think we do have Alison joining us here now. If you could put your video on and unmute yourself, then that would be great, because there are lots of questions coming in for you. And what a great talk. That was so interesting, and your grandchildren are really very, very cute indeed. I love that picture of your 3 grandchildren. That's very, very sweet. I mean, there was just so much that was interesting in there, and there are so many questions that are coming through, and so many things that chime with things we've been talking about across the conference. So I've got some questions of my own, and also lots of the ones that are coming through. So I will start with some of those. I mean, it's interesting that you were talking about the situation with COVID there, and how perhaps we're not, valuing the grandparents enough, and that so many people are separated, and that we are anyway. Somebody in the audience, and we have an audience of hundreds here, so you need to imagine they're all clapping the end of your talk now. Somebody in the audience has asked, what do you think the key consequences or benefits of the COVID situation might be on childhood development when it comes to, say, social separation or the closures of schools that we've seen? What do you think will happen?
Well, I think the general story is that children are extremely resilient. As you can see, they're designed to be able to thrive in many different kinds of environments, which is not to discount the fact that children are miserable about a lot of the things that are happening now, and we need to help them not be miserable the same way we would help anyone else be miserable. But I think some of the anxieties that people have about, is this going to have long-term effects? Is the fact that my baby isn't seeing other babies, is that going to mess up their social development? And again, one of the things in The Gardener and the Carpenter, in my book, is that, to a very large extent, the kinds of small variations in the lives that children have don't seem to have very much in the way of long-term consequences. Now, big things like whether you're growing up in poverty or in isolation, those things do have big consequences. But with a caring bunch of caregivers who are around, then I think there's no reason to think that there would be negative consequences. And my personal hope, I'm not sure this is going to be true, is that it might actually relieve some of the tension of, look, we need children to be in structured school-like, education-like settings every minute of the day, because obviously that's not happening, and it's not happening. And hopefully what will happen is that parents, instead of being terribly anxious about that, will say, yeah, okay, it's summertime vacation, and let children go out and do some of the kind of wide-ranging exploration. I've said before, I have thought about writing an op-ed that said, As a cognitive developmentalist, I can tell you that if you tell your children to go outside and play and give them a nice bag full of crackers and shut the door, that will have tremendous improvements on their exploration ability, their executive function, their cognitive development, and that might even be true.
And do you find, I mean, with your book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, you must have then interacted with many, many audiences of parents. Do you find that parents tend to be relieved that they're not as perhaps responsible for shaping everything about their child as they thought, or disappointed that they almost, I don't know, have less control over shaping them than they hoped?
Yeah, I mean, I think both things are true. So I think one of the things that I say is odd about the book, it's funny, I just saw a blog post that someone had put up saying, oh, this child development expert has this formula for how to be a good parent, which is you need to be a good parent. And then it had a whole bunch of things that you were supposed to do to make sure that you were that kind of parent. And it's very hard to sort of resist that. So the sort of quintessential interview would be the interviewer saying, yes, I think this book makes perfect sense and I completely agree with you. There isn't any formula or recipe that you should use. And I think parents are very relieved about this. Now, just one last thing, Professor Gopnik, could you tell us what's the formula for making your child to come out to be a better and more successful child? So I think it's very hard to resist that. But what I do think is that parents often find it empowering and liberating to think that every single thing that they do at every moment doesn't have the pressure of this is going to shape my child in the long run. And of course, it's not that parents aren't important or that what parents do don't shape what children do, but the things that shape them are the things like loving them and providing resources and providing support, not the things like, well, should I use this sleep technique or that sleep technique, or should they sit facing forward in the pram or backward in the pram? All the things that parents stress about are exactly the things that don't make a difference, and things that we don't pay nearly enough attention to, like the fact that very, very many children are growing up in poverty and even worse in isolation without that village, without the grands and the other people around to take care of them. Those are the things we should be paying attention to if we're thinking about effects on long-term development.
And we do have some specific questions about things that may be kind of do's or don'ts. So I take your point about there not being rules, but one is if children are chastised for the high temperature behavior, if you like, or the exploratory behavior, is that going to be detrimental to their development, if there's quite an authoritarian parenting style?
I mean, again, I think the important thing to say is that the parents and the grandparents as well are in this niche where what they are trying to do is pass on the norms and the conventions and the things that are important in their particular culture and setting. And of course, the children are in the niche of sometimes paying attention to that and sometimes ignoring that. I mean, both of those things are what children are supposed to do. So again, I've sometimes had people say, well, are you saying that, a particular cultural style of childhood, of parenting is wrong? And that's not the point. The point is you could have parents vary a lot in how sympathetic they are to the high temperature search or how unsympathetic they are to it. Anyone who wants to get going in the morning is going to have to put constraints on their child's high temperature search. Anyone who wants their child to actually live to be 5 is going to put constraints on their child's high temperature search. So it isn't as if you have to, not have those constraints. I think the point is for parents to try and find what seems like the right equilibrium between the exploration the kids are doing and the structure that's necessary for resources. And I think this is one of those things, perhaps more in America than in England, where there just are things that are intrinsic trade-offs. So you can't have the best of everything. And as I say, I think in America more than in Europe, there's a tendency to feel as if that's wrong, that you should always be able to have the best of everything. And there are no intrinsic trade-offs. But I think this is an example where there's an intrinsic trade-off between the fact that you give the kids this space and then you need to have a certain amount of constraint. I do think that, at the kind of very high investment in America, we call it helicopter parenting. Hot housing is the word that I like even better in England. I do think that is an example of a very highly constrained kind of caregiving that that probably doesn't have the kinds of outcomes that we might hope that it would have.
And is it inevitable that children will stop exploring so much as they develop? Is that just an inevitable part of development, or are we in education kind of training children out of that because we tell them they must pay attention and do certain things and learn certain things?
Right. Well, I think, again, in terms of this trade-off, I think it's important to say, obviously, my sympathies are with those praised, romantic, poetic, exploring 3-year-olds. But, you would not want to have one of those 3-year-olds as your department head, right? The only reason why the 3-year-olds can do that is because there's a whole bunch of adults, Wordsworth, who's my favorite poet and was the great poet of childhood, who talked about, the splendor in the grass, the glory in the flower that was childhood, also has a line about getting and spending, we lay waste our days. And the truth is, if you weren't out there getting and spending, the children wouldn't be able to see the splendor in the grass and the glory in the flower. So I want to, and children have to grow up to be able to do those things. They have to eventually develop executive function. They have to develop capacities for planning and focus and so forth. So I think the great challenge of the school age period is making this transfer from the preschool. So the first thing is, I think the preschool period is really not a period in which those things are necessary. That's really the great exploration period. And I think preschool teachers and people like the Reggio Emilia program and so forth have recognized that. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about, and I think other people are, is the push to make preschool more and more like academic school. But when you're talking about 7 or 8-year-olds getting into that school age period, then I think there's this really interesting challenge, which is how do you do this transformation of the wide-ranging exploration into competence? I don't frankly think that our schools do this very well. I have a chapter about this in the book. But that is what the agenda is when you're talking about 7, 8, 9-year-olds.
And there's an interesting question related to this, actually, on whether adults could learn to do it. So a member of the audience would like to know, can adults learn to use high temperature learning in the same way that children do for novel tasks? Could we deliberately decide to do that? I mean, naturally, I got all the Blickett questions wrong, of course. Is there a way of us approaching problems deliberately differently to avoid that?
Yeah, I think one of the things about adults that people have pointed out is that we, and especially human adults, seem to retain a lot more of these childlike characters than our closest primary relatives. So human adults do play and human adults do explore. And I think one of the great challenges for adults, for humans, is how do you go back and forth in one life without a mom who's sitting there and taking care of you and toys to play with, but between those two states. And I think an interesting thing is, if you look across many cultures, there are sort of social institutions designed to enable us to do this. So one of them is a sort of division of labor, where some people, like the scientists, for example, get to stay like big children for a lot of the time. So we unfortunately have to go out and wake up early so we can give our talks and all that. But we also get to do some childlike exploration. And if you think about shamans or other kinds of figures, poets in the society, they kind of get to have that niche. But I think even for individual people, things like going on a meditation retreat, one of the things that we've been looking at recently that I think is extremely interesting is the relationship, again, I talk about this a bit in the book, the relationship between some of these mystical states, for example, and childhood experience. So one of the things about being in certain kinds of altered states is that there's much less frontal control, for example. So it's like you shut down the executive part of your brain. You don't do anything. You sit in one place. And there's a much wider plasticity, as the neuroscientists say. And there's evidence now from neuroscience for this increase in plasticity in these kind of altered childlike states. So I think things like brainstorming, things like putting yourself in a context where everything is new, where you don't know what to do, things like presenting challenges, things like bringing someone into an organization, for instance, who has completely different expertise than the people in the organization itself. Sort of putting yourself in the functional position of a novice is a way to get this high exploration. And I think actually people do end up in this state of high exploration, although I think it's never quite as high as the children.
I wonder whether something like multidisciplinary work helps with that. People have been talking a lot today about psychologists and other fields all working together, maybe that is something that helps these novel ideas come, novel ways of thinking.
Yes, and I think there's evidence for that. So as I said, when you have a team and you have someone who comes in from outside who doesn't have the same, the Bayesian story about, like the Blickett detector is, you have peaked priors, you have high priors because you've got lots of experience, so you have very high prior assumptions about things. And becoming an expert is to have peak priors. Part of the reason why experts do well is because they have very strong priors about what's going to happen. But having someone come in who doesn't have those priors can kind of move the whole group back into this more exploratory state. What I was going to say is, by the way, one thing that I think is, again, undervalued is hanging out with children. I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about being a caregiver, is that it's in some ways it's the most adult responsible thing that you ever do. But I mean, for me at least, and I think for lots of carers, it's kind of underappreciated that you get to be in that wild exploratory state when you're hanging out with a 4-year-old. So that would be one of my recommendations.
Yeah, you do get to play, that is true. Somebody in the audience asked, could some of these behaviors be labeled neurodiverse? Could they be part of, say, autism or OCD? Things like the exploring behaviors or the questioning or the impulsivity and the noisiness and the randomness, are they things that would then maybe get labeled as being neurodiverse?
Well, I think one of the morals, again, is that, the same kind of diversity that you see among children, you see among the community of humans. So the idea is that having a wide range of different kinds of cognitive capacities, a wide range of different people growing up in different ways, is part of what, as in the garden, right? It's the thing that makes a human ecosystem resilient. And I do think there's an issue when some of that variability gets labeled as if it's difficulty. Now, actually, the examples that the audience member is making, I think, are not probably not good examples. So something like OCD and anxiety seem to be sort of more on the exploit end. So if you think about the approach avoid experiment that I described, that avoidance learning where you won't go to the thing that gives you the negative outcome, and then you never learn that that negative outcome is actually going to actually might change. That's almost like textbook anxiety and phobia development. So in a way, I think things like anxiety are kind of at the too adult end of the spectrum. But one example is ADHD, for example. So attention deficit disorders, where I think there's a lot of reason to believe that that's just preschoolers' natural state. One of the things I say sometimes is it's not that preschoolers don't pay attention, it's that they don't not pay attention. They can't avoid paying attention to everything around them. And I think it's arguable that that variability in how focused your attention is, for example, is something that is there in the natural environment, and that for most of human history, that was, if not a disadvantage and maybe even an advantage if, say, you're a hunter trying to take in lots of information. But in a school setting where you have this very strange social institutions that require incredibly focused attention, it turns into something that's problematic and even something that is medicalized. So again, something that I think is very concerning is that you see, ADHD diagnoses for 3-year-olds, for example, which seems to me to be totally inappropriate. But and again, that's not to say we live in the society we live in, so you want to do things to help people to cope with the particular society they're in. So if you're someone with very diffuse attention in a schooling situation, you're going to have difficulties, and you might want to try and figure out ways of making those accommodations. But I think that is an example of a kind of neurodiversity.
And somebody asked, what do you think about training programs for parents, parenting training programs?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting problem, and I don't have a simple solution to it. So again, part of the reason why I think we ended up with this carpentry parenting phenomenon, which is a very recent one. The very word parenting didn't show up until the 1970s in the US. And it's that whole idea that there's this parenting thing, and you read books and you get training is very, very recent. And I think part of the reason for it is that if you look back at, say, forager cultures, you learn how to raise children because you're raising children from the time you're very young. So one of the things I didn't mention is among the alloparents, older siblings are the most notable alloparents. So if you were in a forager culture, by the time you were old enough to have your own children, you would have taken care of your own younger siblings, younger cousins, babies, you would have watched not just your own mother, but lots of other mothers, lots of other grands, lots of aunts taking care of children. And that's a really, that kind of practical apprenticeship, that's the way to learn how to do something. And it certainly is the way to learn how to do caregiving. Now, for the first time in history, if I look at my intro developmental class, for example, half of that class has never taken care of a child. So for the first time in history, people are in their 30s and 40s. They've spent a whole lifetime learning how to do things like work and go to school. They have a child. They've never taken care of a child before. And they're on their own. Gran is somewhere across the country. There isn't anyone else around to talk to or to help with it. And that's a really unusual setting for caregiving. And of course, in that context, having some kind of support network, some way of getting information and help does really become important. But I think if we could see it not as there's a bunch of techniques for taking care of children and you have to be trained in those techniques in order to be a good carer, but how could we recreate the village when we're not going to go out and be hunter-gatherers? We're in a contemporary industrial, post-industrial society. How could we recreate a community of people who are helping to take care of children? So one thing that an American writer who's done lovely work on this, Mark Friedman, has done is argued for and actually tried to institute a grandmother corps. So actually have older people come in, not necessarily with their own biological grandchildren, but with somebody else's child who doesn't have a grandmother around, and sort of be the designated grandmom. And that would be a good way of getting information about taking care of children. And there's some evidence, there's a number of programs in the United States, especially with, say, rural, isolated, low-income parents, where just having someone who's around as a resource, just having someone who's had experience with kids and just letting mothers and fathers see, here's what it looks like, that even if it's done in an institutional rather than an informal way, that seems to be helpful.
Yeah, interesting. And here's an interesting question. Are there any links between your work and Carol Dweck's theories about mindset learning? Would that fit in with this exploratory idea?
Yeah, well, it's one of the in fact, Carol and I are friends, and I think one of the ideas is that one of the things that children are learning are these intuitive theories, these everyday theories of how the world works. And the work that I did in the 80s showed that one of the most important of those theories was what we call theory of mind, understanding other people's mental states. So I was one of the first people to do that back in the 80s. And in a way, what Carol has done is show that those theories of mind, especially about things like effort and entities and how it is that you succeed, end up having enormous practical consequences for what children are like and what children do. And certainly the sort of entity theory seems to be very connected to the contemporary parenting kind of picture that, there's some intrinsic property about being smart or being able or being capable. And I think it's very consistent with this, that's maybe the most important thing that children are learning in this period is what is it that other people think about them? They're learning what they're like and what other people think that they're like.
And somebody would like to know, is it true that Jerome Bruner supervised your doctoral thesis? And if so, how did his work influence yours? Was he your supervisor?
He very much was my supervisor. Oh. I did my DPhil in Oxford between 1975 and 1980. And it's interesting because Jerry, I thought it's kind of an interesting natural experiment. I mean, Jerry's an example of someone who probably produced more successful and important scientists in his lab than anybody else that you could think of. If you look at the list of people who were even in the lab at the same time that I was there, just for that brief time, people like Paul Harris and Andrew Maltzoff and Alan Leslie, they're all among really distinguished developmental psychologists now. And yet Jerry did that without ever trying to impose his own particular ideology or theories or views. Very interesting contrast to Noam Chomsky, for example, who had a very strong view and had very few real students because he wouldn't, I mean, this is actually a nice example of this caring, you sort of have the same dynamic as childhood when you have graduate students. And I do think that sort of like there's this additional period of plasticity in graduate school where you arrive and you're novel and you can find out all sorts of things. And I think your graduate advisor is a lot like a mother in those circumstances. In fact, at a fellowship for Jerry, I said, the thing about Jerry is he's the world's best mother. He gives this kind of space and protection in which his students could discover their own, could find their own paths. But certainly lots of things about Jerry's approach, the idea that children are active learners, the idea that caregiving provides them the context in which they can find out about things. Those were very much Jerry's ideas, and I think they've been very influential on all of his students. You can sort of trace a path among contemporary cognitive developmentalists, and we figured at one point like half of us were Jerry Bruner students and half of us were John Flavel students, and John Bruner, Jerry Bruner, and John Flavel sort of are the two roots to cognitive development.
Sounds as though he was a good gardener, which is a good thing to do. And is there any, what advice would you give to early career researchers, or those doing their doctorates now? There'll be lots of people in that situation who are at this conference watching. What would you advise them?
Well, again, I think Jerry and his lab is a good model, although one that's, now I'm going to sound like the cranky old lady, but one that's much harder to institute nowadays. So this is not going to help, guys, but I can tell you, when I got my DPhil, I had 0 articles because we did not have the contemporary model where, okay, you crank out articles with your supervisor's name on them, and you need to have a whole bunch of them by the time you graduate. It's not good advice not to have published anything now, but the point is that the idea was, look, you can just use this time to explore, to figure out what you're interested in. You shouldn't be in that narrow exploit path too quickly. Now, of course, again, in practical terms, you do have to have some of that narrow exploit path. But I think students, again, sort of overestimate how much there's a formula or a recipe. Sometimes I think students think, oh, all of us faculty, like we have the secret book that has the formula for success and we just won't share it with the students. And in fact, often the students who are doing things that are most eccentric, most not fitting the formula, most exploratory, are the ones who end up being the most successful. So for example, one of my very best students, Laura Schultz, is now at MIT. At the time she joined our lab, she'd never done any psychology. She'd done a philosophy degree about Nietzsche. She was living with her partner, her wife, in Oregon, was commuting back and forth to Berkeley, like was not doing any of the things that you'd think that you should do. And I think having had, 10 years of experience raising children, being in another world, actually suited her, was very good for her as she started her scientific career. So I think we're likely, again, to think that we shut down that period of exploration perhaps a bit too quickly. But on the other hand, I mean, I recognize that there are real resource constraints that might make you feel as if you have to narrow. But I think students tend to overestimate how much that's true. When I'm on grant review boards, for example, I'm struck, even with very different people on the grant review board, people are remarkably sensitive to saying, oh no, this is something that nobody's ever done before. That's great. Let's see if we can fund this. We can fund this project. Versus, this is pretty well-trodden territory. This is someone who's been very productive, but they're not really taking risks or exploring.
Yeah. So it sounds like people shouldn't be afraid of trying to do something new.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah. That's a very good point to end on, I think. Thank you so much, Professor Alison Gopnik. That has been, absolutely fantastic, and lots and lots of food for thought there. And thank you for getting up early to talk to us, and thank you for recording it, especially last week as well. That's very kind of you indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me in these tricky and difficult times. And it's nice to talk to all of you, at least remotely, and nice to be back in England again, at least remotely. I must say I am missing that. I was very much looking forward to the thought of being back in Britain, but next year.
Next time, exactly. Next time. Thank you so much.